Under a sky bruised with storm clouds, Elias Turner stood motionless, the shattered locket in his pocket burning like a coal against his thigh. It had been his mother's, its hidden spring saving him from a traitor's knife decades ago. Now, its twin gleamed on the chests of three bound souls atop a rotting stage, their fates sealed by a man whose voice Elias still heard in his nightmares. The crowd's silence was a blade at his throat, urging him to stay hidden, to stay safe. But as the first rope snapped taut, Elias felt the locket's jagged edge, and with it, the life he'd tried to forget. Dust Haven lay quiet, like a dry scar on the map. Its weathered wooden houses crouched low beneath the purple mountains. As evening fell, the sunlight thinned through the clouds, spilling a golden layer over the fences. The saddles hung on nails, and the porcelain cup set beside a pile of firewood. Elias Turner sat on the porch, his calloused hands resting on his knees, listening to the wind comb through the dry grass. He had learned how to live quietly, like a riverbed drained after the flood season. Few words, slow movements, in no hurry to prove anything to anyone. People in town knew he fixed fences on Wednesdays, pulled weeds on Friday mornings, and never overworked a horse. They did not know that inside his house, in a chest, lay a neatly folded child's dress, its edges still carrying the faint scent of old lavender. The plague years ago had passed like a dull knife cutting into bone, not for the instant pain, but for the lingering ache. Since then, he had kept certain habits, locking the door twice, tying 3 knots in the reins, and looking longer than necessary at strange footprints on the ground. In the mornings, Elias brewed thick black coffee, drank it in silence, his ears tuned to the shifting wind. He led his ash-gray mare out to the pasture, checking each plank, each twist of wire. Since losing everything, he had closed himself like a winter window, still open a narrow slit for light, but bolted tight so that no wind could slip in and shake what was still fragile. His wish had shrunk to something almost beyond words, a place where no one was driven out, no one forced to leave out of fear, just to stay, just to be safe. Amid those days that seemed to stand still, small signs would make his heart falter. One morning, outside the north fence, a scorch mark appeared. The ashes were still warm. Someone had come in the night. Nearby, deep hoofprints overlapped the tracks of a wolf. Elias stood there for a long time, eyes narrowing. An old feeling rose like a shadow. Suspicion. He was far too familiar with the kind of thing that arrived in silence and carried loss with it. Often, it wore a wide-brimmed hat and smiled thinly in the saloon. Sometimes, it wore a soldier's coat. Sometimes, it was just the averted eyes of strangers as he walked past. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, walked along the fence, and kept his heartbeat in check. Near the corner of the fence, the wire had been cut. A clean slice, not the work of an animal. He bent down, touched the edge of the wire, fresh, damp. By a clump of cactus, there was a footprint, the heel worn uneven. He followed the trail for a short stretch, then stopped when he heard the quickened breathing of the gray mare. She had halted, snorted, her shoulder twitching. The saddle strap had brushed against the patch of skin scraped a few days earlier. Elias laid a hand on her flank in a light pay pat, his eyes still sweeping the surroundings. The scene was empty, only wind, only grass, only his old heart beating as if to remind him, trust no one, let no one cross this boundary. He returned and mended the wire himself. As he drew the last strand tight, his hand touched something unfamiliar, a length of new wire, neatly coiled, hooks already fitted, placed right at the base of the post. Beside it lay a small roll of tanned leather, with a bit of brown ointment and a strip of clean cloth tucked inside. Elias looked around. No one. On the wooden post, a thin cut marked the grain, like a blade tested for sharpness. Someone had stood exactly where he now stood, in the night, begun a repair, and left it half done. The suspicion in him rose higher. A trap, perhaps? A favor meant to be repaid in an uglier way? By afternoon, the clouds hung low, and the light went out as quickly as if someone had closed their hand. Elias led the mare into the stable, meaning to ignore the leather roll. But the gray rubbed her leg against the post, letting out a low whinny, the scraped skin seeping blood. He took up a bottle of liquor, intending to clean it roughly as always. His hand brushed the leather pouch again. The ointment had the sharp, green scent of wild leaves, a dark brown color, thick as late-season honey. He hesitated. Then he spread on a thin layer. The mare stood still, her eyes blinking slowly, her breathing easing. The salve sank in, first hot, then warm. The sting faded noticeably. Elias stood there, his hands still smelling of leaves, and felt something inside his chest come loose, like a piece of wood long wedged in the current, finally breaking free and drifting away. That night, Elias sat on the porch. The sun had gone. The mountain range was a jagged black silhouette against the deep violet sky. He rested the rifle against the wall, poured more coffee, and listened to the crickets scratching at the darkness. The suspicion in him hadn't vanished, but it had eased a notch. The feeling of someone outside the fence was no longer purely a threat. It carried another note, thin as a thread, of kindness. The jolt wasn't from fear, but from realizing that the other hand had been more deliberate than he'd imagined, cutting the wire at the right spot so it could be mended tight enough not to give in when the wind rose, leaving ointment so the wound wouldn't grow cold and fester. Doing the work, then slipping away, asking for no glance in return. Before going inside, he took an empty tin can, dropped in a handful of freshly roasted coffee beans, and set it atop the north fence post. No note, no sign. Just a small thing, enough for someone, if they returned, to understand that this place had received a kindness and kept it where it belonged, quiet, without fuss. The night stretched a little farther. The wind carried with it the scent of the season's first snow from the mountains. Elias leaned against the doorframe, looking out across the dark yard. He still locked the door twice, still tied 3 knots in the reins. But when he slid the bolt into place, his hand was lighter. Deep inside himself, beneath the long-dried layers of caution, there was a patch of earth just touched by rain. He did not name it. He simply left it there, still, like a seed that need not sprout yet. And in the silence, a quiet gratitude ran through him, not aimed at anyone, only at the way life sometimes sends a hand, then withdraws it before it can be seen. That day, Elias had planned to head into town to buy a few coils of rope and some new nails. When he tied his horse to a post at the corner of the livestock market, the change in the air struck him at once. A crowd had gathered in a ring, their murmurs compressed like bees in a hive. Through the hum of voices, the crack of whips, and the smell of horse sweat, Elias saw a makeshift wooden platform, and on it, 3 figures with their hands bound. They were native women, tall, sun-browned, their faces worn with fatigue, but never lowered. Their eyes were bright and cold as freshly honed blades, sweeping over the crowd without a flicker of fear. A rope was wound around their wrists, pulled tight, until the skin flared red. The slanting afternoon light caught in their thick black hair, glinted on the small scars along their wrists, and flashed on what hung around their necks, a string of beads with a silver feather at its center. Elias froze. The sight struck into his memory like an arrow through an old crack. That silver feather, he had seen it in a bitter winter many years ago. In a blizzard, when he was collapsing in an icy ravine, 3 figures had pulled him out of the skin-slicing wind, bound his wounds, and vanished into the dense fog. He had searched for them, asked everywhere, but met only headshakes and wary looks. Since then, he had kept the story to himself, like a wound no one believed was real. And now, here in the market, they stood before him again, but bound, being called for sale, like livestock. Around them, the auctioneer's voice rang out, the numbers leapt, then faltered when no one bid higher. Elias felt his pulse change rhythm. The ordinary world, the town, the market, the hammering from the blacksmiths, slid away, leaving a hollow space where he could hear only the wind and his own heartbeat. He stood within the crowd, his shoulder angled just enough to see more clearly. Yet, he did not move closer. The old instinct for caution clung tight to him. This world had betrayed him too easily before, and what the eyes saw could well be a trap. And yet, The gleam of those 3 silver feathers in the sunset seemed almost intent on defying that safe distance, drawing him, inch by inch, out of his familiar ground. And in that moment, Elias understood. There are moments in life when no matter how fiercely one tries to keep still, something will come, quietly, but with certainty, and compel a step forward. They stood on the wooden platform, 3 figures as motionless as if carved from ironwood. Though the ropes bit into their wrists, they kept their shoulders straight, their chins slightly lifted, their eyes never lowered. In that gaze, Elias saw neither pleading nor defiance, only a kind of search, distant and patient, as if they were scanning the crowd to see whether what they sought still existed here at all. Beneath each of their throats, the silver feathers swayed lightly in the wind, catching the sun into a small flicker of light. Elias froze, as if an invisible hand had gripped his shoulder. There was no mistaking it. This was the very sign of the 3 figures who had pulled him from the ice-choked ravine that winter long ago. He still remembered the smell of wood smoke threading through the fog, the rough hands wrapping cloth around the wound on his leg, and the pale, white morning when they led him to the mountain's edge, pointed south, and then vanished. When he returned to town that year, he had told a few people. In return, came only mocking laughter and a shake of the head. Where'd you get a story like that? No one believed a man lost in the snowy mountains could have survived thanks to 3 native women. The story had hardened into a sealed scar, untouched, but throbbing whenever the weather changed. Now the memory rose in fragments, vivid enough that Elias almost forgot he stood in the middle of a crowded market. The space around him seemed to narrow until there was only the wooden platform and the 3 silver feathers trembling. But reason pulled him back. They were being sold. And he had only one purebred horse. The gray was all that stood between him and hunger. It hauled the hay wagon, carried the loads, and was the last possession left to him after the lean years. He gripped the reins so tightly that his knuckles blanched. A voice sounded by his ear, not from anyone in the crowd, but the old whisper lodged in his mind. Don't be a fool, Turner. You lost everything once because you trusted the wrong people. The familiar suspicion rose, cold and heavy, as the stone propped against a door. He took a step back, his eyes still fixed on them. None of the 3 seemed to recognize him, or if they did, they gave no sign. Only the eldest's gaze lingered on him a heartbeat longer before sliding away, like wind skimming over a lake, leaving ripples, but no reflection. Elias drew in a deep breath, telling himself this could be nothing more than coincidence. The world had no shortage of things alike, from silver rings to boot prints in the dirt, and he had no right to believe in anything that might make him weak. The auctioneer's gavel struck, snapping Elias back to the present. The number was called, and no one answered. The crowd began to murmur. A few turned to leave. Elias stayed where he was, eyes locked on the wooden platform, his chest crowded with something that felt part fear, part a summons from the past. He knew well that if he stepped forward now, it would not just be a transaction. It would be a clean strike into the shell of caution he had built around himself all these years. And once that shell cracked, there was no telling what might come rushing in. At the edge of the crowd, Elias spotted Cart McVeigh. The man stood slightly angled, arms crossed over his chest, the brim of his wide hat casting a shadow across half his face. His smile was as thin as a fraying rope, yet wide enough to reveal a set of teeth, perfectly even, unnaturally white in the red, dusted afternoon. Elias knew that smile well. McVeigh had worn it when he seized a riverside plot from a migrant family, and again when he drove Elias's horses off the pasture to steal his water rights. Cart was not the noisy kind. He was more like a slow sickness in the soil, not killing outright, but spreading, draining the life from everything nearby. Now, he was bidding not to buy labor, but to flaunt that he could put a price on anyone, even a human being. The way he looked at the 3 women was no different from the way one might appraise a horse, glancing over the shoulder, gauging the muscle in the arms, then nodding in satisfaction as if checking off a good purchase. Elias stood within the crowd, yet it felt as though Cart's gaze cut through everyone else and fixed directly on him. For a moment, Elias could almost hear him calling, "Come here, Turner. Let's see if you've got anything left to hold on to." In those eyes, Elias recognized what he despised most: power wielded for the sole purpose of breaking others and finding pleasure in it. A gust swept across the auction yard, snapping the tattered flag on the wooden pole. No one spoke. The auctioneer's voice rang out, then fell away like a pebble dropped into a dry well. The silence was not respect. It was the complicity of those who saw injustice and chose to stand still. Elias looked at the three women. They stood as they had when he first arrived, their eyes sweeping over the crowd without lingering on anyone. No sign of recognition, no smile, no nod. Only the ropes, the silver feathers, and the distance. He realized suddenly that if he turned away now, it would not only be their chance to escape Cart that was lost, it would be the last of himself as well, the part that still believed he was a man who could act when it mattered. Once more, the wind swept dust and the scent of dry grass across his face, as if to remind him that the biggest choices often arrive quietly, without fanfare, carried only in the look between two people standing at opposite ends of an invisible line. Elias tightened the strap of his hat and took a step forward. He stepped out of the crowd, his boots pressing into the thin layer of dust, stirring it in small swirls around his heels. No one stopped him, and no one called out. Leading the gray mare, he walked straight to the wooden platform, the reins held firmly in his hand. His eyes never left the three bound figures, but his ears caught the faint rustle from the crowd behind him, the murmur of those about to witness something out of the ordinary. The auctioneer opened his mouth to speak, but Elias didn't answer. He simply extended the reins, a simple gesture, wordless, as if trading for any ordinary good. The gray turned her head toward him for a brief moment, then stood still, her breath rising in thin clouds into the air. The metallic clink rang out as the chain lock dropped, sharp and short, yet carrying far in that moment. The three women stepped down from the platform. None of them said thank you. The eldest simply looked at him, her gaze holding for a moment longer, then tipped her head slightly, a gesture hard to name, not quite greeting, not quite acknowledgement, but something in between, as if both of them understood something that needed no words. Elias led them to the wooden house at the edge of town. The road passed through the last of the season's yellowed grass, the sound of wind brushing against dry pine trunks like someone letting out a long sigh. They kept some distance from one another as they walked. No close steps, no conversation. At the threshold, Elias pointed toward the old room beside the stable, where a low wooden bed stood, with a thick blanket and a few worn work clothes. He lit a fire in the stove and set 3 bowls of hot soup on the table. When they sat down, he didn't ask where they had come from, why they had been captured, or whether they remembered him. They didn't ask why he had helped them. They simply ate, slowly, silently. Outside, the wind circled over the roof, carrying the scent of wood smoke. Night fell, and the firelight cast the shadows of 4 people across the wall. In that silence, Elias realized it wasn't the heavy silence of mistrust. It was more like the long days of winter, when people sit around a fire without speaking, simply waiting for spring to arrive. And within him, a single strand of caution loosened. Not much, but enough for him to know he had set foot on a road from which there would be no turning back. Weeks passed, and winter crept into every seam of the wooden house. That morning, Elias opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and froze. Lying right on the wooden step was a bundle of silver feathers tied with a frayed red thread. In the early frost-lit air, the feathers swayed lightly in the wind, reflecting a pale but steady gleam, like embers hidden within ash. Beneath the porch, the damp earth held the clear imprint of fresh footprints. They led toward the pines, where the mist was gathering into a thick white curtain. Elias followed, his boots sinking into the damp layer of fallen needles. The scent of pine resin and cold air mingled, curling in every breath. On the narrow trail, the 3 women stood, each beside a saddled horse. There was no greeting. The eldest handed him a soft leather pouch. When he opened it, Elias found a hand-drawn piece of parchment, a map leading deep into a mountain valley. The lines trembled slightly, but were steady and intent, marking a small river and the sign of a village with symbols he could not understand. Just by looking, Elias could feel the urgency in every stroke of ink. No one explained, no one asked, but the spaces between the markings spoke more clearly than words. That place was in need: hunger, cold, sickness, and perhaps worse. Elias gripped the map tightly, then turned back toward the house. He gathered his rifle, a handful of bullets, a few packs of dried meat, cornbread, a hunting knife, and a thick blanket. Everything packed neat, without excess. When the moon rose, its silver light lay over the saddles and his coat as Elias stepped out and locked the door behind him. They spoke neither of the destination nor of time. They simply mounted and rode. The sound of hooves on hard earth was steady and restrained, with no one urging the pace. The scent of night sank into their clothes, the cold pressing through gloves. From time to time, Elias glanced sideways and saw their faces in the moonlight, resolute, revealing no trace of weariness. The road drew them gradually into the darkness of the forest, where the wind's voice was swallowed, leaving only the creak of saddles and the steady breathing of four riders. No drums, no music, no flare of drama, only the winter's cold breath and the sense that each step carried them deeper into something none of them dared to name. A month later, Elias returned to Dust Haven. No one knew where he had gone, and no one asked right away. The gray mare was gaunt, her mane clumped with dried mud. The saddle bore a film of gray dust, and a long tear ran along the shoulder of his coat, threads fraying like an old crack in timber. He tied the horse to the post, slipped off the reins, and quietly carried a small bundle into the house. On the wall opposite the hearth, Elias hung the bundle of silver feathers bound with red thread. It sat there, plain as a dry branch, but in the firelight each strand caught glints like fragments of memory. That night, the wind howled over the roof, its sound like a far-off song drifting through the dark. Elias sat back in his chair, his eyes resting on the feathers for a long while. His gaze was no longer clouded, but neither did it carry the constant edge of suspicion. When someone stopped by and asked, half teasing, half curious, he only took a sip of coffee and said, "Warm enough?" Somewhere, deep in the forest, the three figures were perhaps standing on a slope, looking down toward the valley. The wind carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke through the mountain passes. Elias knew that if the day ever came when they needed him, he would ride out again, without hesitation. The story closed without truly ending. What remained was a quiet, like the last patch of winter snow that has yet to melt. A silence holding space for whatever comes next, when the hands that once gripped each other in the cold will find each other again. No matter how long or winding the road may be,